Has Yahweh promised you anything that hasn't come to pass yet? Let me just say this. You can rely on His word to perform His part of the word or the covenant. I say His part because you have a part to do. That is conditional. In this week's session, we will see how Abraham reacts to the words of Yahweh, even to the point of Yahweh making a covenant with his man, a covenant of blood. Hello, I'm Dr. Ray, and welcome to this week's Hosea International Speaks. Abraham has just returned from rescuing his nephew from his captors, and he has met with Melchizedek and the king of Sodom. Chapter 15:1 says, after these things, telling us that it was a while or sometime after Abraham's encounter that he would have a vision. Things in Canaan seems to be settling down when Abraham has this vision that seems to have terrified him. Yahweh comes to him in a vision, and the first words to Abraham was, "Fear not." It would probably be a fearful thing to see Yahweh. What was Yahweh's waiting for when he said to Abraham, when he said, your descendants will come back here, because only then will the Amorites be ripe for punishment. He was waiting for the Amorites to be ripe, or as one translation says, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. We're going to look at that phrase a little later in this session, because there's a question that Abraham puts to Yahweh, and he asks a question which brings on a fearful dream or a vision. His question to Yahweh was, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward or the one in my household who will take over is Eliezer? In other words, in those times, it was a custom that if the owner of the property and that which is around him, if he did not have an heir or an offspring to take it, he would hand it to his steward. In other words, how do I know I will possess this land, which the Yahweh had told Abraham that he would do? Remember that back in chapter 13 and 14, that he set him on a hill and he told him to look east and west and north and south to all the parts of the country. And what he is saying is, how do I know after I am gone that my son or sons will be able to stay in the land? Abraham's question was legitimate. How would he know that others won't come and possess the land that was promised to him and his descendants? At this point, Yahweh tells Abraham that his descendants will not be from the servants in his household, but they will come from Abraham himself. Yahweh doesn't use Sarah's name because legally Abraham was married to her and no one else. And according to Yahweh, this would be the vessel, Sarah, he would use to bring Abraham's descendants into the world. It was Sarah and Abraham's lack of understanding of Yahweh's promise. This should be a lesson to us who are waiting on Yahweh. Our number one question is, what has Yahweh said? And then walk that out in faith, believing that what he has said will come to pass. What Yahweh does at this time was demonstrate his power and his authority. At this point, what Yahweh does is sear into the mind and the memory of Abraham for as long as he would be on the face of the earth. He would sear something in his memory that Abraham at the time would train and teach his children. Abraham would experience a visible form of a covenant with which he may have already been accustomed to. Yahweh knew exactly what would convince Abraham that what he said is true. It would be a covenant of blood, or a blood covenant. This is one of the most unbreakable bond that existed in Abraham's day. And in some countries in Africa, it is the same today. This was a covenant that brought with it a curse and promises, and in some cases, even death. Each party of the covenant would pronounce a promise to the other person and then a curse if they broke their part of the covenant. But in this case, it was a one-sided covenant, a covenant that only one party had to keep. It was Yahweh's side to keep the covenant. For him to fail would be to cause his own destruction. And that is exactly what Satan was looking for. He was looking to see that Yahweh would fail. But to the ignorance of the adversary, Yahweh already has his number. All Abraham has to do to keep his part of the covenant was relay Yahweh's message to his descendants. In other words, teach his children. And even still, after all of that, Yahweh would keep his part of the bargain, and he would appear to Isaac and Jacob, the offsprings of Abraham. Note, in order for the covenant to be applied also, Abraham had to keep the buzzards out of the covenant. Abraham's part of the signing of the covenant was to provide the sacrifice. Yahweh would do the rest. He would walk, Yahweh, in the midst of the sacrifices and consume them. We may even look a little closer on the covenant of blood in future sessions, an area that is still used today. Now, the phrase that comes up in this portion of the scripture, which is just said, and then nothing more is said, which we find in chapter 15, verse 16, they shall return, talking about the Israelites, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And I want to read an article written by a pastor who gives a great explanation of this. And as I read it, I want you to consider the times we are in and what the prophets have spoken when it comes to the phrase, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. We have used the phrase, the cup of iniquity is full. And the person is Pastor Piper. And in his article, what does the slaughter of the Amorites mean? Probably tells it best. And I quote him, to understand what was happening when the people of Israel stormed the cities of Canaan and slaughtered their inhabitants, we need to go back about 500 years. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 and 16, God says to Abraham, your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. Then, in the fourth generation, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The return of Israel to the promised land from Egypt would correspond with the completion of the iniquity of the Amorites. This is the meaning of the slaughter of the peoples of Canaan. God timed the arrival of his judgment with the fullness of the sin to be judged, not before. God did not jump the gun. He was, in fact, long-suffering and endured the idolatry and the sins of the nations for centuries. I want you to keep that in mind. Giving them rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying their hearts with food and gladness. We can see that in Acts chapter 14 and 17. And then he quotes another person, Derek Kidner, which he says, until it was right to invade, God's people must wait if it costs them centuries of hardship. Chapter 15, 16 of Genesis is one of the pivotal sayings of the Old Testament. But there comes a time when the sins of the people are complete. That is the saying for decisive judgment, or this is the time for decisive judgment. The appointed instrument of God's judgment was the army of Israel. But God sees himself as the effective warrior behind the defeat of the Amorites. He says to Joshua, I brought you into the land of the Amorites, and they fought with you, and I gave them into your hand, and you took possession of their land when I destroyed them before you. Joshua 24 and verse 8. God did the destroying. It was by the hand of Israel, though, that the judgment of God came. This does not mean that Israel's motive was always holy. At times it was not, but the just purposes of Yahweh are being carried out, even at the times Israel had wrong motives. In fact, God warned the people against pitiless pride in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 4 and 5. And I quote, do not say in your heart, when the Lord your God has driven them out before you, because of my righteousness, the Lord has brought me to possess this land. But it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you, in order to confirm the oath which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, this carnage is not about human injustice, but divine judgment. The Amorites provoked God to anger for centuries by their idolatry. So much so that centuries later, the king Ahab was compared to the Amorites. He acted very abominably, following idols according to all that the Amorites had done, whom the Lord cast out before the sons of Israel. And you can find that in 1 Kings chapter 25 and verse 26. At this point, I'm going to detour a little bit because I believe that Yahweh is about to bring judgment on the governments of this world. And the only way he is able to do this is he uses it through the ecclesia. The judgment will bring down those in authority and put up those who will listen and heed to his word. It is also a time when the ecclesia needs to reach out to the world and show who Jesus really is. And we will see such a harvest not known to this point. A harvest to today that I believe could bring in over 1 billion souls, maybe even more. And as you see in today's sessional lesson, Abraham had to do his part. We have been called individually to do our part. We need to find out what our part in it. There's only one way. Ask, pray, and believe. Have faith that God will do his part in your life and that he will help you fulfill your part as long as you are on the face of the earth. Let me just say this in closing. If you like this week's session, just go ahead and hit the like button right about there. And if you want to be notified the next time we go live, go ahead and hit the subscribe button right about there. And then you can also write me at HoseaInternational@yahoo.com, or Hosea INT Speaks. That's Hosea INT Speaks at gmail.com. I'm Dr. Ray, and I'll see you next week on Hosea International Speaks.